Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we'll be exploring reincarnation as it's experienced in tribal societies. With me is anthropologist Dr. James Matlock, who is the co-author with Erlander Haraldson of a recently published book titled I Saw a Light and Came Here, Children's Experiences of Reincarnation. Dr. Matlock has published dozens of academic papers and book chapters on the subject of reincarnation and related fields. He is the developer of an academic course called Signs of Reincarnation, which to my knowledge is the only such academic course anywhere focusing exclusively on the experimental and field studies evidence for reincarnation. In addition, he is a regular contributor to the online Psi Encyclopedia sponsored by the Society for Psychical Research in England. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
You pretty much have spent your professional career in anthropology looking at reincarnation and its many different manifestations, both in scientific research and in tribal societies throughout the whole world.
Yes, I have. I came to anthropology from parapsychology. I already had developed my interest in reincarnation in working with Stevenson's cases, and had come to be acquainted with the phenomenology of those cases, including the things we've talked about in earlier conversations, the memories of children, as well as the behavioral patterns and the birthmarks.
Yeah, I might mention
features.
For our viewers, this is our 9th interview now, so for people who really want to dig into the literature, check our listings for the previous 8.
Well, anyway, so when I came to anthropology then, chose that as my professional field, I was interested, first of all, in whether whether reincarnation beliefs appeared elsewhere in the world.
Yes.
And as I began to look into that, I discovered not only were there beliefs everywhere in tribal societies throughout the world, but when ethnographers, anthropologists had reported them, they had reported in association with the beliefs the same sorts of signs that were studied by Stevenson and his colleagues in conjunction with cases.
In other words, these tribal societies intuitively used an empirical approach in developing their reincarnation beliefs.
Yes. And it was not only the reincarnation beliefs, but survival beliefs in general are empirically based in observations and experiences. Sir Edward Tyler, who wrote a book called Animism.
Back in the 19th century, as I recall.
That's right. It was first published in 1871. It's gone through several editions.
Yeah.
It was first published in 1871. And he reviewed, at that time there was not any real anthropology, no professional anthropology, but he reviewed reports from tribal societies, from indigenous societies throughout the world, from colonial administrators, missionaries, travelers, many of whom had described under the heading of religious beliefs or simply of cultural traits, the belief in reincarnation and associated with that these signs, and more generally, survival, beliefs. And Tyler pointed out that these are often associated with what we now call apparitions, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences. There could be dreams in which human figures appeared, and so forth.
In other words, the modern notion that these tribal societies were very primitive and they had superstitious animistic beliefs completely ungrounded from reality is not what Tyler found.
Well, no, and it's not what he was talking about when he labeled these animistic beliefs.
Yeah.
What he had in mind was the spirit beliefs grounded in experience as a conclusion from experience. And the same thing with reincarnation. He found an empirical basis for that too, in the same sorts of signs which we study today: the birthmarks, the announcing dreams, the children's claims to remember having lived before.
Yeah.
And so it was quite interesting to see that not only were these beliefs grounded in these observations and experiences, they were empirically based, but that these were the very same signs that we study today in parapsychology as evidence of survival.
Well, most people, I imagine, many of our viewers are going to assume that reincarnation is a concept that comes to us from Hindu culture, and we don't find it elsewhere. That's simply not true.
It's simply not true, no. There's an axiom of anthropology that the more widespread a trait is, the older it's likely to be. And in my research, I found reincarnation beliefs and cases on every continent. Except Antarctica.
Well, and of course,
understandably,
there's no population there
to have experienced these things, so we can understand why. But everywhere else, and not just on the continents, in most areas of the continents too, including Europe. If you go back, you find reincarnation beliefs and cases reported among the Scandinavian peoples, among the Gauls, the Celts.
Well, I don't have a number. But I would imagine if you were to try to count all of the different indigenous peoples, maybe according to their language or some way to demarcate one from another, I know that even gets tricky, we're probably talking over 1,000.
Oh, easily. Yeah, many thousands. Yeah.
Many thousands.
Yeah, I would say. Because there are just so many of these different tribal societies, each with its own language, each with its own culture. And even in the same area, you may find a lot of different languages or dialects spoken and different cultural practices.
And probably within the anthropological community, these have all been enumerated.
All is maybe a strong word, but certainly many of them have been studied.
I know every now and then they seem to discover a new...
but I'm not even sure that every single group that's known has been studied in anthropology.
Okay.
But certainly a good number of them have been.
A good number of them have been. Let's assume over 1,000 in any case.
Yes. And the cross-cultural studies, which have worked with these, have found reincarnation beliefs in anywhere from about 37% to upwards of 50% of the societies in a given sample.
So
it's
to
really quite
a
widespread.
third to maybe a bit over a half.
Right, of the indigenous societies. This is based on the samples, the study samples, but, I think it's fair to generalize from them, and say that maybe roughly half of indigenous societies have been reported to have reincarnation beliefs, often with accompanying signs.
And I think we can safely assume that these beliefs are probably quite old, prehistorical in these societies, and that these various cultures, let's say the Aborigines of Australia and the North American Indians of the Northwest or Alaska, have had very little contact, if any contact.
For a very long time.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, we know that, the human species originated in Africa, but would have dispersed out of Africa quite a long time ago. So that's right. I mean, Australian Aborigines would have had very little contact with the West Africans for a very long time. West Africa being another area in which we find these beliefs quite commonly.
So it's probably fair to assume that these beliefs originated independently and based on, as you have pointed out, the tendency of these indigenous people to observe the various empirical phenomenon that we are also observing that point towards reincarnation belief.
Right. Well, I would say, it's hard. to know what to infer from this data in terms of the origin of the beliefs. But definitely we can say that even if an original human population had reincarnation beliefs, and that's entirely possible, but that it's the signs, these different signs that we've been talking about, the behaviors and the physical signs and the
yes, which we have elaborated on in great detail in previous interviews.
Right. That those would have supported the belief and could easily have given rise to different beliefs. And as we learn more about the history of human population, it becomes more and more complex, even in Africa. Yeah. So there may very well not have been an original society from which we are all developed, but it could be much more complex.
Now let me make sure I catch that. It sounds like what you just said is the further away you go from the human origins in Africa, the more complex the beliefs become.
No, well, we just don't. What I'm saying is in terms of human origins and the development of the human species,
yes.
The more we get into the fossil record and so forth, the more we realize this is really a very complex picture. And it's far too simplistic to say there was some sort of aboriginal human population from which all of the humans emerged.
Right.
It's more likely it's much more complex much more branching than that, which implies, I believe, that the signs that seem to have given rise to reincarnation belief and definitely support them these days may have been part of not only of the human heritage, but of the pre-human heritage.
I mean, hominids.
Yes. I mean, they may have experienced birthmarks and behavioral patterns and, who knows? I mean, even memories. So we have no idea how far back reincarnation goes. And in fact, if reincarnation is a fact, we would expect it to have shown up, before humans arrived. I mean, there's no reason why it would suddenly appear when humans appeared.
Well, part of your study looks at the various cultural patterns of the different indigenous tribes. There's a wide variation amongst them.
There really is, yes.
And the way in which their reincarnation beliefs interact with some of their, for example, kinship patterns.
And other social practices, too, is really very interesting. There are just a variety of social practices in animistic societies and tribal societies that are related to reincarnation beliefs, as if the practices arose as a way of taking advantage of the beliefs. In other words, which for them weren't beliefs after all; they were scientific observations.
From their point of view, it was based on observable. What we would call empirical reality, through the normal senses.
Right. And so, I don't think it's wrong to characterize that as a scientific observation. And so, for them, reincarnation was an accepted part of life.
Yeah.
And in developing these practices, I'm suggesting, they were trying to take advantage of the fact that we return after we die.
For example?
An example of an advantage would be one of the things we see in many of these societies is practices that seem to be designed to identify the person through the name, through giving them the same name, and then through the name allow them to inherit property and both tangible property.
The practice of naming a child after a deceased ancestor.
Right, based on signs, then is tied to the inheritance of material and immaterial property like status. Because
a lot of people joke today, if I hope I can be reborn and then I can inherit my wealth. If I put $100 in the bank now and I'm reborn in 100 years, imagine what that will be with compound interest.
Yes, absolutely.
So, but this is, it's a fantasy for modern people to think that way, but in indigenous cultures, there may have been more gratuitous.
I believe so. Yes, I believe so. And there are other practices too, which seem to be designed to take advantage of reincarnation. For instance, in many societies, you find children, particularly children, but sometimes adults too, buried in the home, in the floor of the home, or by paths, to facilitate the return to the same parents or in the community.
Yeah. Well, it is my understanding that a lot of the modern Western distaste that we have for corpses and for the dead is not shared by tribal societies.
Not always. Sometimes it is. Sometimes you get a great fear of the dead, because there's the idea of, in some societies, that apparitions may be hanging around, ghosts may be hanging around the dead, and if you go near them, the ghosts want company, and so they may cause you to die too.
But if you bury your relative under your kitchen floor, you probably don't feel that way.
You don't feel that way. That's right. Where you do find beliefs like that, there may be a good reason for it. It may be that somebody died from a contagious disease, and if you don't know that it was a contagious disease, you can still observe if somebody goes near that body, they might catch the same disease and pass on too. And therefore one can see how, again, you come back to empirical observations leading to beliefs and to practices.
So the fundamental lesson in all of this seems to me to be that because people come from a primitive society does not mean that they as individuals are less intelligent and less capable than city dwellers.
Absolutely not. Or that their cultures are less sophisticated. They're just sophisticated in a different way. Another way that that reincarnation shows up is, as you suggested, in the kinship patterns.
Yes.
There are societies that, unlike our society, reckon kinship either through the father or the mother alone.
Yes.
We do it bilaterally. We don't, make a strong distinction there. But there are societies who recognize only the father or only the mother is transmitting kinship in the society. And interestingly enough, in those societies, we see the reincarnation patterns. That is not only the beliefs now, but when we look at the cases. And what we call solved cases, ones in which the previous person spoken about has been identified.
And here we're again talking about typically spontaneous memories reported by children.
That's correct, yes. So when we look at cases in which there is an identified previous person associated with in agreement with the children's memories, behaviors, and so forth. In tribal cultures that have these unilinear concepts of kinship, the cases fall in the appropriate line. For instance, the Tlingit Indians of Alaska are matrilineal, and the cases there fall predominantly on the mother's side.
Not exclusively.
Not exclusively. There are exceptions. Now, the belief is, the ideal is that they do, and it can create problems sometimes when signs suggest something else.
So that suggests that the cultural belief is impacting the actual operation of reincarnation.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, and the converse example would be the Igbo of Nigeria, who are patrilineal. And there we find the cases on the father's side. So the fact that the spirit after death seemingly can discriminate and decide that it's going to go in the appropriate reincarnate to the appropriate relative on the mother's side versus the father's side does suggest that there is some control involved.
Well, in either case, the notion is that the reincarnation takes place within the family.
Yes, or within the the family line, at
the
least.
extended family.
Yeah, within the extended family, at least within, it becomes a little bit too technical to describe how they reckon kinship. So sometimes what they reckon as a maternal relative may not be exactly what we mean by in the family.
I see.
So that's why I'm hedging a little bit there.
Yeah.
In the family line, in the maternal line versus the paternal line.
Okay, well that's important. But of course, the other alternative explanation would be that if a case is discordant with cultural expectations, the people are less likely to make it known so that researchers wouldn't be aware of it.
Well, that's true. That's true. But we do have cases in most of these societies that are discordant, and we can then look at and see how they're handled. They're sometimes recognized and sometimes not, depending on the culture. But they can't be socially recognized in the same way. If you're not born to the appropriate relative to receive your name, you can't receive it back again. And if you don't receive your name back again, then you're not eligible to inherit your property. So there is this incentive then to follow the cultural norms.
And, well, it does sound like, as has been my understanding, that tribal societies do tend to be more rigid about these things.
In their ideology, yes.
I mean, if you're living in a tribal culture, it's very different from living in a cosmopolitan culture.
Yes. I mean, you're talking about a much smaller community.
And of shared beliefs.
Right. But there are different social organizations. I don't want to give the impression that all of them are either matrilineal or patrilineal. There are some bilateral ones too.
Yes.
And with the bilateral ones, we do not see a tendency for the cases to cluster on either the mother's or father's side. They're much, they again follow the social organization in being bilateral.
Well, all of this would be consistent with your view, I gather, that the deceased person has some control psychologically within their consciousness as to the how and when and where they might reincarnate.
Yes, absolutely. And then I might mention that in tribal cultures is something else that we don't find when we get outside of the tribal realm, when we move into state-level societies in Asia and the West. And that is the idea that you can plan before death where you're going to be reborn. Now, in Tibet, you do have advanced lamas and so forth saying that they're going to be reborn in a specific place or, in a general place, in a general area, but they never tell you specifically where they're going to be reborn.
Whereas in the tribal cultures, that's more
they
common.
Often do, yes. They will say, they'll pick out their future family, their future mother, and explain why they want to go there. They'll sometimes say, you'll be able to identify me by this or that mark, and it shows up.
And then also the announcing dreams.
And announcing dreams are very important
in tribal cultures. I'm guessing that tribal cultures tend to pay more attention to dreams in general than cosmopolitan cultures.
I suspect so. And anthropologists who have worked with dreams have pointed out that that the dreams in these societies often appear to be more realistic than the dreams we experience here for some reason. And they also more often seem to include the images of spirits. Including in these announcing dreams, which are dreams that are had by a pregnant woman or a woman shortly to become pregnant, or sometimes her husband or another relative, that in which the spirit of a deceased person appears and represents that they intend to be reborn in that family.
And I gather in some of these tribal societies, you have shamans who are specialists in helping to determine the identification of a newly born person, who it is exactly that they might be the incarnation of.
Yes, you do. And this can be of assistance when there are not sufficient signs to indicate, who a newborn was. You go to the shaman or the priest or the oracle, and they make the identification. Antonia Mills has a case in which there was a child born without announcing dreams, without birthmarks. They took the child to the shaman, and the shaman made the identification that they was a relative, to the dreamer. Then, as the child grew up, he was taken back to the location where the previous person had died accidentally. He recognized the place. Memories then began to flow, and he talked more about his memories.
And visiting that location served as a trigger.
It served as a trigger. But what was interesting is that this was the same person that the shaman had identified him as having been. Maybe, the grandparents who took him back there, they would have known this story. They would have known about the identification. So you can say, well, maybe a skeptic might say, the grandparents helped shape this.
Yeah.
Maybe he was told by his parents and grandparents as who it was. But nevertheless, it is interesting that some years after the shaman made the identification, the child does develop his memories.
Well, there's a funny paradox in this, because as I talk to reincarnation researchers, I get the feeling that on the one hand, they have a pretty low opinion in general of information that comes from so-called psychics or mediums. But when it comes to indigenous cultures and to the shamanistic practitioners within an indigenous community, the researchers seem to have a higher regard for the work that they do.
Yes, I think so. I think that's fair to say, and this is consistent with the empirical basis of their beliefs. They've observed also that there is such a thing as telepathy and clairvoyance, and that there can be people, specialists, very often shamans, who are specialized in these practices and in mediumistic practices and so forth, in contacting the spirit world and being able to bring back information from the spirit world.
Well, do you think there's a bias against the contemporary practitioners?
In what way?
That they're held in lower esteem than indigenous shamans?
You mean in
Western
city. Society,
yes.
say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you would have subpopulations, subgroups that have these beliefs, but the dominant culture that we live in does not respect them. No.
I see. So I'm just wondering if this is true with regard to tribal beliefs in general, that anthropologists just favor tribal cultures over their Western cultures from which most of them originated. Right.
Well, anthropologists who are drawn to these tribal cultures generally become more interested in these things.
Yeah.
That is, Psi experiences and signs of reincarnation and signs of survival, simply because they hear about them all the time, and they want to understand the beliefs of the people that they're working with. I have another hypothesis, and I don't want to get too far off track with this, but it just occurred to me that if I'm an anthropologist and I become friendly with the local neighborhood palm reader, for example, and I announce to my colleagues that I've been studying palm readers and I find them to be accurate, I'm going to be laughed at. They're going to make fun of me, and my career and my livelihood will be threatened. Right. But if I go to Borneo and I spend time with the Dayak natives in Borneo, and I become friendly with a local shaman, and I write an academic paper about how this shaman has certain gifts that are recognized and acknowledged and seem important within his culture, I'm safe.
People aren't going to laugh at me.
Right, but many anthropologists can't. They bring their skepticism with them, and even though they're describing these things, they still maintain a distance from them, and so they don't come to accept them, to believe in them.
Well, originally, the standard view in anthropology was that shamans were schizophrenic.
Right. This was it took a while for the discipline to disabuse itself of that notion and get beyond that. That was out there for a while.
So there are many. What can you say? The field of anthropology has evolved quite a bit since those days.
It has. One thing I want to mention, coming back to social practices and so forth, an interesting facet to that Antonia Mills has brought out in an edited book that she did called Amerindian Rebirth. She has a paper there about the Gitskan practice of wearing earrings. High status individuals wore earrings. And she describes a series of cases of young children born with earring birthmarks. Which I find interesting. There are other earring birthmarks turn up in other parts of the world too. Ian Stevenson has quite a few in his Reincarnation in Biology. But in indigenous societies, these earring birthmarks help not only to identify the child specifically as a high status individual reborn.
Very interesting. And now, in one of our earlier interviews, we talked about the practice of, I think we called it experimental birthmarks, where a body is marked.
That's right, yes.
In order to see whether a young child, a baby, will be born with those same markings as a way to identify the new incarnation.
Right.
Is that a practice that is common amongst indigenous tribes?
No, I wouldn't say so. It's very widespread in Asia. You find it all the way across Asia. But it's mostly reported not in the indigenous tribes, but in the more developed societies, which suggests that it's a practice that has some time depth, but was not a part of the original indigenous tribal societies.
It evolved.
It seems to have evolved later, and yet spread, quite far. I mean, we find it all the way from Burma, Thailand, through China, across to Japan even.
I see. Well, with regard to tribal cultures, is there anything more we should add before we conclude this program?
Off the top of my head, I can't think of anything.
Okay, no, I think we've done a good job of covering it once again.
I think we have, yes.
Dr. James Matlock, thank you so much.
And thank you. Good job.
And thank you for being with us as well.